My name is Amy Allen, and I am a PhD candidate at the University of Oklahoma. And today, the presentation that I'm going to share with you, I called Connecting History to Current Events by Engaging in Place-Based Education, which I realize probably sounds kind of boring, but I hope that the talk is not going to be very boring. I'm going to start with saying, while I know it is possible in the classroom to create and teach engaging lessons about past events that generate student interest and connect them to current events, we see in research that that goal sometimes becomes easier when students are able to participate in an experience that diminishes the effects of time or distance. So, for example, it's significantly easier for students to visualize the harmful impact of slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction when standing with present-day self-proclaimed reparationists in the Green Meldrum House, as shown in this picture, in the room where William T. Sherman met with local Black leaders to create the plan known as 40 Acres and a Mule, which was enacted after the Civil War but later repealed. So in the civil rights movement on present-day racial inequality through the analysis of student responses at the end of the experience. And so I actually think this ties in really nicely with what Brandon was talking about in the last session that I just left a little bit early, because he mentioned that there is a myth that racism concluded with the civil rights movement, and pointed to the fact that the legacy of slavery is evident throughout the civil rights movement. And further, Sharp writes about slavery as a history that is unresolved, that shapes our current times, and Love challenges us to engage in work that disrupts and challenges whiteness and hate. So in response to this, in this study, I'm going to share details of how place-based education offers an opportunity for teachers to respond to this challenge and construct experiences that enable students to interpret the racist world they live in. So a little bit of background about this. This study focuses on a 2-week J-term experience titled The Effect of the Civil Rights Movement on Racial Inequality. J-term is a pilot program that we just started at the school where I work. I'm the Director of Education Development there, and I also am the director of this program. And after we come back from Christmas break, similar to colleges, we decided to start taking a 2-week term that isn't part of any of our regularly scheduled classes, where teachers can create their own courses and allow students to investigate things that are outside the scope of our normal curriculum that they're passionate about. So this course in particular was 3 days on campus and included 9 days of travel to Savannah, Montgomery, and Tulsa. And I think it's important to note, as I read some of the reflections from the students, that this class was pass-fail, so there were no grades. They didn't have to agree with anything that I said, and so their responses truly could just be how they felt. As the primary instructor in developing this experience, I used program structure and pedagogy to intentionally create a focused learning environment where students engaged with historical events while centered in the places that those events occurred in a way that disrupts the dominant narrative presented not only throughout the South, but in many textbooks. And so throughout the study, I explore connections between the experiences of students with the theoretical framework of pedagogy of place or place-based education. So according to Sobel, I might be saying these names wrong and I apologize, somebody can correct me later. Place-based education can be defined as the process of using the local community and environment as a starting place to teach concepts. And Grunewald furthers this idea by describing the concepts that places can teach. Places teach us about how the world works and how our lives fit into the spaces we occupy. In his assertion that humans should examine the way places impact culture and identity and embrace our roles as placemakers, Grunewald suggests 5 dimensions of place that can be used to analyze place-based education, and these include perceptual, sociological, ideological, political, and ecological, and I'm going to talk more about those throughout this presentation, and I'll define them when we get to them. So with all of this in mind, my research question was, what are the experiences of faculty and students engaged in place-based education? And for what I'm presenting here today, I'm just focusing on students because that's all of the data that I've analyzed so far, and I've saved the faculty member experiences for later. This is basic qualitative research that is centered in the traditions associated with action research and self-study. The study was designed to serve both as a model for planning instruction and as a systematic inquiry to help us better understand the theory, what the theory underlying the 5 dimensions of place-based learning looks like in practice. So this study took place at a small private Christian school in the South, where I am, as I said, the Director of Education Development. The participants included 5 high school seniors who were involved in the launch of a J-term program. This is all the seniors that we had this year. So this is a growing school. It's only about 7 years old. It's our last small class of seniors. After this, we have 2020, 36, 54. So the school is really growing, but we thought with this small group, it was a perfect time to try out a new program. In this case, the initial offering was only this course. So they didn't have a choice but to participate in it, and the school paid for it for the pilot program. So I designed the course and I served as the primary instructor for the course. And in addition to that, I'm a graduate student and social studies methods instructor at OU, as I mentioned earlier. Other faculty members who joined this trip included the headmaster of the school, the chair of our theology department, and in Georgia, an art historian from a local university also accompanied the group, and her expertise informed many of the planned outings. So throughout the course, students were asked to engage in the experiences with the following prompt in mind. How does knowing and thinking about the narratives of history we have available impact our ability to make sense of and act in the present? Throughout the course, we will attempt to answer this question, especially as it relates to the history of the civil rights movement and our responsibility to love our neighbors. So while the above question has greater implications, for this specific course, we might ask, how do the narratives of the civil rights movement we have available impact our ability to make sense of and act in the present? And so that was communicated to them the first day of the course, that was the goal of the course. And on the last day, they were required to write reflections that responded to that prompt. Data sources for the study included lesson plans and course materials, as well as written reflections about the question posed above from student participants. And then to engage in data analysis, I compared these artifacts against Grunwald's 5 dimensions of place. Throughout the process, connections between the 5 dimensions of place, the places encountered during the course, and the experiences of faculty and students emerged, which I will share in my findings section. So I'm going to share one sort of vignette for each of these 5 dimensions of place. And I think I could probably share a lot more, but I just tried to pick an example that would illustrate each one well. And so on each of these following slides, you'll see a definition of the dimension and a course experience, and then a quote from a student. And that shouldn't actually be there. It should just say quote from student, because this was my model page. Sorry about that. So here's the first one, the perceptual dimension. In describing the perceptual dimension of place, Grunwald says, a theory of place that is concerned with the quality of human world relationships must first acknowledge that places themselves have something to say. Human beings, in other words, must learn to listen. To tell the story of the civil rights movement, you must start at the beginning, slavery. That's why on our first day in Savannah, I scheduled a tour of the sacred places where enslaved Africans dwelled between 1751 and 1864. During this tour, with a well-known and respected African-American storyteller, participants were asked to listen to what these places had to say. We visited a port where enslaved Africans were forced to first unload the ballast stones used to weigh slave trade ships down during their journey across the Atlantic, and then use those stones to build the roads, which are pictured here. To build the roads they would travel on during their journey to the slave market. The roads built with ballast stones still exist, and if you are listening, they are telling the beginning of the story of race relations in the United States. Providing the opportunity to listen to these places proved to be deeply impactful to students on the trip. This was evident when students discussed their senior research project. One student's project drew on this experience and was titled, "It's Not My Voice That Needs to Be Heard: How Community Suffering and Listening Can Flourish into Racial Reconciliation." And in her course reflection, she said, "The biggest takeaway for me is that there is still work to be done. There are still stories that need to be recognized and told. I kind of want to work with," she named a local organization, "so that we can bring even more attention to the history and injustice that has been done in our city." So for at least one student, this educational experience helped develop her ability to listen to a place and perceive what it had to say. Grunwald suggests a fundamental paradox of place then is that although we can experience it everywhere it recedes from consciousness as we become engrossed in our routines in space and time. In this case, traveling somewhere new enabled her to make connections and reveal insights about a place, her hometown, with which she was deeply familiar. And the next dimension is sociological. And the sociological dimension ties places with the lived experiences of humans. Becoming aware of social places as cultural products requires that we bring them into our awareness for conscious reflection and unpack their cultural meaning. So I think traveling into the Deep South, especially if you're not from the Deep South, requires an understanding of unique cultural and social practices. So in preparation for the trip, students and teachers spent the first 2 days in the classroom reading and discussing materials that would help us gain an understanding of relevant issues. One of these readings included a blog post titled "How Dixie's History Got Whitewashed" that highlights the role of the Daughters of the Confederacy in the South. One way this role manifested culturally in our experiences of physical spaces was evident when we visited both Laurel Grove Cemetery North and South. And those are pictured here. On the left is Laurel Grove Cemetery North, and on the right is Laurel Grove Cemetery South. In Laurel Grove North, we see the result of the lost cause and states' rights narratives artfully woven after the Civil War to justify exoneration and glorification of Confederate soldiers and the Confederate cause, myths later taught in schools across the South thanks to efforts by the Daughters of the Confederacy. As a result, in Laurel Grove North, we find a marble sculpture dedicated to the Confederate dead, while at our feet are dozens of pristine and well-preserved graves marked with the dates of the Battle of Gettysburg, July 1 through 3, 1863. On the other side of this segregated cemetery, Laurel Grove South, we see a wooden sign mostly obscured by overgrown plants designating slave burials. In this space, we find only a handful of primarily unmarked graves of enslaved people, those who died in obscurity and have remained silent for over a century. Referencing this experience, a student says, "Laurel Grove Cemetery remains segregated as much as the surrounding communities, not in law, but in reality. The white side, well-funded and well-kept, while the Black community remains poor. We cannot always trust the history that is told to us by those in power, because oftentimes the history told by the powerful helps maintain their power and change the narrative of truth. We understand that the African American community is a historically oppressed community. That comes from a neglect of their side of history and an unwillingness to admit the truth. You cannot have healing without truth." As students unpacked the cultural meanings of this segregated cemetery, one side well-kept, even in the spaces that are cared for and maintained, one side well-kept while the other side, even in the spaces that are cared for and maintained, is visibly showing a wealth disparity. And this brought into their consciousness ramifications of slavery and the Civil War that continue to impact those living in the present. The next dimension of space is the ideological. This is the third dimension, and it centers on relationships of power and the way place functions and legitimizes ideologies. One function of space, Grunwald says, is, I'm going to pronounce this word wrong, and I practiced, hegemonic. Domination is maintained not through material force, but through material forms. Historically, history is told from a white perspective. Other voices are silenced. When we engage in places that have problematic undertones without questioning the narrative being presented, we become complicit in a process that legitimizes the ideology embedded in these material places. In all three cities visited on the trip, students experienced places that told history in both ways. After reading an article from the New York Times, "Enslaved people lived here, these museums want you to know," we visited the Owens Thomas House, a historical home in Savannah that has actively worked to change the narrative of their tour experiences by giving voice to those who were enslaved. In the Owens Thomas House, the foundation has quite literally named the enslaved who worked in the home in one of their exhibits, while other monuments, like the Confederate Monument in Forsyth Park, highlights white stories and ignores all other perspectives, despite calls from the community to recognize them. And so these two pictures are, the top one is the Owens Thomas House and the bottom is the Confederate Monument. This experience was also deeply impactful to students. As future placemakers, it's important to teach students to question the places they engage in. Whose voice is heard? Whose is silenced? Students heard and internalized this message. In his course reflection, one student commented, "History has been suppressed in order to maintain a false sense of security and act as a shield against difficult issues. But hearing different perspectives on racial issues builds relationships and humanizes people. The only way to have racial reconciliation is to hear from those affected by it." While this trip took students to places outside of their local communities, throughout the course, students referred back to things they could do to make places that gave voice to those who are silenced in their hometown. The fourth dimension, political, considers place within a global context of power, struggle, and resistance, and is attentive to what looks like for those on the margin. During our time in Montgomery, Alabama, we had the opportunity to not only retrace the 1965 Selma to Montgomery March, which directly led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but also to visit the Equal Justice Initiative pictured here. The Equal Justice Initiative traces Black history from enslavement to mass incarceration. These two places highlight the political dimension of place by shining a spotlight on the struggle experienced by people of color, as well as the resistance they engaged in. On their website, EJI acknowledges that this is their goal, creating a physical space that represents the struggle and resistance experienced by people of color. They say, for more than a decade, EJI has been conducting extensive research into the history of racial injustice and the narratives that have sustained injustice across generations. Our new museum is the physical manifestation of that research. These two experiences were extremely powerful for the students on the trip. In response to our visit to Selma, one student said, "One of the people who shared their story was John, who drove us around Montgomery and along the route of the march from Selma that was led by Martin Luther King Jr. He actually walked one of the 5 days of the march. John brought the history to life through his personal experience. He also talked about how he still feels the effects of segregation and racism today. Personally, I had never drawn the connection that the civil rights movement happened so recently, so it makes more sense to me now why so many people are still hurting. It has been truly powerful to hear the firsthand accounts of people who lived through this history. Through learning the past, we can work to reconcile the future." Additionally, in response to visiting the Legacy Museum at the Equal Justice Initiative, another student said, "There are still stories that need to be recognized and told. I kind of want to reach out to EJI so we can bring more attention to the history and injustices done in our city. Now that I've been to cities that have monuments, museums, and historical markers that aren't perfect, but at least they are there, I have an idea of what our city could potentially be, and I want to be part of making that a reality." In both cases, seeing the spaces where political struggles took place or where they were experienced impacted students in meaningful ways. In one case, gently but visibly shifting her belief system, and in the other, deepening her resolve to not only know more, but to educate others and bring change to her own city. The final dimension, ecological, explores ways that modern economies function in ways that damage and destroy ecosystems that support human and non-human activities. Closer to home, students made a day trip to the Greenwood District, the site of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. In this neighborhood, students witnessed the aftermath and lasting impact of not only the massacre, but also the result of interstate highway routes designed by state and local governments to destroy urban African-American communities, which is pictured here. This is a interstate that runs right next to the site of the Tulsa Race Massacre Memorial. And we had to walk under it to get from one part of the African-American neighborhood to the other. One part has the memorial and the other part has businesses. Beyond government involvement, highway planners also did not hide racial motivations. In 1949, the American Road Builders Association wrote to President Truman that if interstates were properly routed through metropolitan areas, they could contribute in a substantial manner to the elimination of slum and deteriorated areas. This is an example of an ecosystem steeped in ecological dimensions of place, not only the physical place occupied by the interstate highway routes, but the role of a modern economy that deliberately and openly supported white human activities while destroying African-American neighborhoods in the name of economics. His reflection, a student said, institutions of government have failed to remember and tell the story of the African-American community, and systemic racism is still present. And so in conclusion, this is a quote from one of my students, also from her reflection. From the beginning of this 2-week experience, this student was very skeptical about why this course was relevant, kind of combative, even resistant to engaging in the readings, and frequently referring to her parents' belief system as evidence that the readings were biased or just not true. And so by the end of the course, outwardly, I witnessed a change in her actions and her word. And I think you can read this, but I think it's important that she said at the end, slavery and pain and hatred were real, and they're still in effect today. So she went from feeling like this is kind of not true, I don't really believe it based on my experiences with my parents, to saying like, oh, this is a real thing. And because we don't require grades or anything, I feel like that really probably was her honest opinion. So moving forward, I'm going to teach this again in January with a larger group of students, which I'm really excited about. And one thing, I love to do Q&A at the end of this, but I'm also going to post the reading list that I used for this class. And I would love anybody to give me feedback on things to add or subtract from that reading list, because I'm constantly growing and would love to be able to improve that list if possible. So thank you all.
Outstanding. Thank you, Amy.
I think this presentation works really well with Amy's, and so I'm excited that you are going first. But I'm Sara Demoiny at Auburn University, and I wrote this paper with Stewart Waters at the University of Tennessee, who's unable to be here this evening. And so I want to talk about using powder monuments that are starting to be on our landscape to challenge the master narrative, particularly the ones as a model in Kelly Ingram Park. So I want to start with kind of a current situation happening in Alabama right now. In 2017, the state legislature passed the Alabama Memorial Preservation Act, which fines cities or institutions $25,000 for removing a historic monument, particularly Confederate monuments. In this past year, and early in the legislative session, there was attempts to amend this to give local communities, local cities, their own governing agency to decide whether or not they wanted to remove monuments without a fine. And that was not passed. And later in the legislative session, there was a new bill proposed and got into committee that I think will be taken up again next year, to change the 2017 law and to make it where cities would be fined $10,000 a day for a removal of a Confederate monument, which clearly would inhibit that from being able to happen. And so I know that this is kind of an example within Alabama. There are similar examples that are taking place in other places in the country. And so I want to kind of think about this in terms of schematic narrative templates, because clearly our monuments and memorials are telling stories, right? And Wersch talked about schematic narrative templates as these kind of generalized structures that are not based on one specific event, but really more kind of abstract narratives that are used to tell truths about certain people and events that we want to be told. He gave the example from kind of a Russian and former Soviet Union history of kind of a schematic narrative that plays out there often is the expulsion of foreign enemies. And that narrative continues to be told over and over, not for a specific historical event, but continues to be part of the national narrative. We could think about that in the US as something like that we are a righteous country that always makes progress, right? Or we could see in the previous example, this schematic narrative of a lost cause narrative that continues to be perpetuated, particularly in the South. And these schematic narratives continue to be ingrained through cultural toolkits that are everything from formal education that we have, textbooks that we have, public holidays that we celebrate, the discussions around the dinner table where those continue to be ingrained and retold. Monuments and memorials continue to also, they're one of the tools within that cultural toolkit that propagate these schematic narratives. And they are, as visitors go to see them, this public pedagogy that's on our landscape that continues to tell us a particular way to make sense of and to remember and think about the past. And so in this moment, we definitely see this fight about what the collective memory is going to be, right? And so in 2016, the Southern Poverty Law Center put out a report identifying over 1,700 Confederate monuments and place names that are still public symbols within the United States. And we know that part of that schematic narratives that continue, the stories that continue to ingrain this deep collective memory that we have is the use of heroification that Lowen talks about. And we know Aldridge and Woodson have talked about how one effect of heroification is that individuals become messianic figures. And when that happens, that creates this this obstacle kind of the everyday citizen to think they can take any kind of civic engagement or make any change because they'll never live up to being like this messianic figure is. Also with heroification that often happens within monuments themselves is this discourse of undetectability that Leonardo talks about, where white individuals are recognized as excelling in all parts of civic life and in culture, yet they disappear when they are contributors to any type of oppression being remembered. And so with this fight for collective memory, we have seen this kind of pushback of counter memory. Whedon and Jordan talk about counter memory as challenging the power and interests that are being upheld by the collective memory. And one effect that has come from counter memory is the development of counter monuments. Kuznowska talks about counter monuments as reenacting these discourses of memory that have been rejected, that have been silenced by the collectivity, and they began and were developed in Germany as artists were trying to wrestle and think about how are we going to remember this hard history of the Holocaust without using the same tools that Nazis used in kind of propagating a blind allegiance. And so in the literature, counter monuments are talked about as dialogic and anti-monumental. And I'll just quickly say that on the right side, you'll see there an example of a dialogic counter monument. That's where a counter monument is created to be in direct kind of dialogue and opposition to a pre-existing monument that's there. The picture here is from a temporary counter monument that was removed. This is Madre Luz that was in Baltimore in 2015. On the left-hand side, you'll see some common characteristics of counter monuments that come up in what is called the type of counter monument, anti-monumental counter monuments. And the first characteristic is the subject. The subject of counter monuments are focused on some type of hard history, really bringing out the voices and experiences of those that have been oppressed, while at the same time holding oppressors accountable. The form is usually very different than a traditional monument. Most traditional monuments are kind of grandiose in nature, bigger than life. And so some forms of counter monuments may include like inversion, physical inversion to the ground, or this void space that is part of the design of the counter monument. The location of counter monuments are usually not in a touristy area, but are kind of come up upon just by happenstance by those that are passing by. The meaning of counter monuments are not usually straightforward. There's not usually a plaque telling you exactly what you need to think, because it is, there's not an easy answer to what is being shown and remembered within the counter monuments or counter memorials. And the visitor experience is not for you to just glean information or become more informed, but there's really a call for action on your part as a visitor within counter monuments. And so I'd like for us to think about counter monuments that are in Kelly Ingram Park as a way to jumpstart and include within an inquiry that students could do. So Kelly Ingram Park is in Birmingham. It was a major site within 1963 as part of the modern civil rights movement. And in the early 90s, there was a concerted effort by the city to create a civil rights district, and Kelly Ingram Park is there within that. Diagonal from one corner of the park is the 16th Street Baptist Church. And three corners of the square, it's a complete kind of city block square. At three corners of the square, there are traditional monuments that you would see, like the one on the right, the three kneeling ministers, which is looking at or kind of memorializing, remembering Palm Sunday in 1963. And within the park, as they were re-envisioning the park itself, they talked about this being a place of revolution and reconciliation, and really wanting to think about that. I'll also say that as this kind of re-envisioning was happening and new, some of the counter monuments were being placed here, this was less than a decade, or just about a decade, after Maya Lin designed the Vietnam Memorial, which is, I think, one of the first counter monuments here in the United States, at least it has been written about in that way. And she was very clear about kind of her purpose in that, and some of those counter anti-monumental characteristics. And so within Kelly Ingram Park, there is a circular path that goes through. It's called the Freedom Walk. And there are several counter monument installations there by James Drake. And so the first one here is called Water Cannons. You can see a teenage young black man and young black woman that are here. They're kind of trying to shield themselves, and you see the water cannon that is there pointing at them. As a visitor, you're walking through that scene, and in most of these counter monuments, you'll see that visitors are required to kind of walk through the scene and through this space. For the second one, it's called the Children's Crusade, specifically looking at, and all of these are specifically looking at the Children's Crusade that happened in May 2nd and a few days following in 1963, where over 1,000 children, young activists, were jailed for their participation in this march and nonviolent protest. And so this is a kind of a two-piece monument, and the walk goes between them. So on the back part, you'll see a young black boy and a young black girl that are on a step, and ingrained underneath them is the phrase, "I ain't afraid of your jail." And then on the piece that is closer to, you see that it's kind of like prison cell. And then along the rectangular piece on the top, on the inside, flipped and reflected upside down, is the phrase, "Segregation is a sin." And so as you're walking through that, you're really thinking about the activism that these young teenagers and children were doing and what they were saying. And then as you look on the opposite side, you are seeing kind of flipped on its head the institution that is continuing to uphold and oppress the sin, the segregation, the institutionalized racism that's taking place. This third counter monument within the Freedom Walk is called Attack Dogs. As you are walking through, you're kind of maneuvering your way around the three-dimensional attack dog figures that are here. And as we know, and we have seen images of, police dogs were used to try to deploy the people that were in Kelly Ingram Park and around this area. And then at one of the corners, the one that is diagonal to 16th Street Baptist Church, in 2013, Elizabeth McQueen was the artist sculptor who created the Four Spirits monument that is here. This is representing the 4 Black girls who were murdered in the racial terror of the church bombing at 16th Street Baptist Church. And you see kind of this juxtaposition of this counter monument of the girls kind of dancing, of talking to one another, playing. You see the shoes of one of the girls here. You see another girl, you know, doves coming out of her hand, and then across the street is the site of racialized hatred and terror. And so in looking at these counter monuments, you can see some of the characteristics that I was talking about before. One, in the form here, all of these are of dark metal and kind of blend in some ways into the space. They're definitely life-size. They're not larger than life, grandiose figures. Clearly, it's representing a hard history, and the visitor experience here is really forcing you to kind of see these events through the eyes of the children activists that were involved as you're kind of walking through these scenes and in this space where this happens. It's also calling you to kind of think about the naming of this place being a place of revolution and reconciliation, and asking yourself, are we still in a place needed for revolution, right? What is my part in this work of reconciliation, and kind of thinking through that as you are going through the park. And so Stewart and I were wanting to think about how could this be used in kind of a C3 model, an adapted inquiry design model, to think about using counter monuments as a way to think through some of the collective memory and obviously the history of this space. And so starting out with kind of just this overall question, are counter monuments needed on the national landscape? Clearly, teachers would need to give some background information on what counter monuments are. There's a great clip by Maya Lin about her explaining how she designed the Vietnam Memorial and kind of talking about elements of counter monuments, which would be a great way to kind of start this in terms of defining a counter monument in and of itself. And so then there are 3 supporting questions to focus on the legacy of the Confederate monuments in our country, and how the history of the monuments have been connected to the fights for civil rights. And so you see 2 sources here that can really just be juxtaposed. One from the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and looking at the statement, you're able to see the collective memory that they are wanting to be told and wanting to continue to be ingrained. And then you see this report from the SPLC about when these symbols were created. I'm sure many of you have seen this report, but they have really great graphics there to show events that were happening and when Confederate monuments were actually installed or rededicated, and how that aligned with other events in history way after Reconstruction. And so after establishing a foundation of the strong attachments and feelings citizens have to the monuments and memorials, the next question prompts students to explore how the civil rights movement traditionally has been portrayed on the national landscape. So through these different sources, students can really think about how these are traditional monuments that often are still teaching heroification instead of collective action. And then moving from there, going to Kelly Ingram Park, looking at these examples of counter monuments and thinking about the movement through the eyes of a collective group of people, and here specifically youth activists that were working together. For each of these, there are kind of formative tasks that we talked about as possibilities as well that I'm not going to get into for time's sake. But then thinking about having students take informed action of looking and researching hard history within their own community, and then creating a design for a possible counter monument that their community could have, and sharing that design with local leaders. We wrote this paper, and some of the sources, I would change it a little bit if I was doing now just to update. But thinking about some extensions to this, I really think you can also pull in a lot of acts of counter monumentality that have been taking place in the past year, a year and a half. And so an example could be really bringing in how people put projected images of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd onto the Robert E. Lee statue in Richmond, Virginia, and kind of talking about those acts and kind of reclamation of those spaces. Also exploring, as Amy was talking, and she had pictures from the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, having students look to see, is their county represented in that memorial? And if so, looking at the names of people who were murdered through racial terror lynching and the history of that within their own county. And then finally, another extension or possibility could be having students think about doing a spatial analysis of their own town, looking to see what histories are being portrayed here, what histories are being honored, what is the collective memory of our town, and who is not being part, who's not being told, who's being silenced, and what is the counter memory that we maybe want to bring into our town. And so these are just some ideas of thinking about things that are happening clearly here and present, and thinking about how we can take that into an inquiry and think about the public pedagogy that's really all around us, and the use of counter monuments could be maybe a different way to start thinking about doing that. Thank you.
Sara, you could imagine, given that I live in Atlanta, that there has been so much discussion about the Stone Mountain Monument. But it's certainly almost all that I've been reading about what's under consideration is contextualizing or moving, you know, like the Confederate flags into another place or so forth, because they're also limited by right now what the law says in public property. But I haven't heard of anybody talking about building counter monuments out there.
I think I haven't either. I think that counter monuments are still pretty, at least from what I have read, and I could definitely be wrong, but are pretty new still to the United States. I mean, I think this is much more known in Germany, and there are many examples of counter monuments in Germany where that originated. And James Young, I think, coined that term and really talks about that. Myelin really did, I think, pull from that work and talks about that in the Vietnam Memorial. And then the EJI, I think, is another really great example of a counter monument. I don't know that they use that term in describing themselves, but all of those characteristics are present. And so I think, Carol, definitely, I think that's something that should be brought into conversation. Like, what does that look like to create a dialogic counter monument here? And for that conversation to be happening in space, right, within that space. But I do think that that is something that is worthy of people considering and talking about and thinking through.
And it's the local high school students who've really organized that got down the obelisk, and they're now trying to get down a cannon that was anti-indigenous peoples from Decatur, Georgia.
I didn't hear that last part. You're not muted, but it didn't come through. I don't know if other people heard it. It may just be on my end.
I didn't, yeah, no, I didn't hear it either. Carol, you want to repeat just the last part of what you said?
Oh, just that I was so pleased that it was the high school students who had taken, well, had really pushed on the issue of the obelisk was the Confederacy, and then also this cannon which was against the Cherokee And that has not yet been removed, but it's the high school students who keep persisting and showing up at all the meetings. And again, I haven't heard anybody talking though about counter monuments to go on the Decatur City Square.
Danny, did you want to make a point? Ask a question?
Yeah, I have a question for both Amy and Sarah. I'm gonna also date Sarah first, because I think this is an interesting follow-up. At least I think it's interesting. Have you experienced in those in these counter monuments, or have you witnessed certain racial groups interacting differently inside of it? Do you see that when African American families or the black population going through them, it's more sentimental, whereas the white population going through them does it more as sort of like an exercise or a walk? And do you think there's a potential way that we can maybe gather some of that information? Because I don't, that would be something I would be very interested in reading. But I don't know if you've seen anything like that.
I haven't seen that specifically. I know that Patterson, and I'm forgetting her first name off the top of my head, has talked about counter museums, pulling from the idea of counter monuments. She talked about that with the Jim Crow Museum at Ferris State University. And one characteristic of that was the space for dialogue within the counter museum. And so I think that, I'll just say, I take students every semester, well, not this summer, Kelly's on here as one of my students, not able to in the summer, but to EJI, to the museum and to the memorial. And they do a lot of reflecting work. And so there's definitely conversations of white students who talk about, I feel like it's not my place to be here, like that this isn't my history, and so, you know, we've definitely talked about that. I have a paper under review about some of that data right now that hopefully will come out. But really thinking about whiteness and using critical whiteness to really analyze what they're doing, and how this could be a tool within kind of whiteness pedagogies as well, I think. And so it has been really interesting. I know with some of the groups, I have done a better job of kind of talking about white emotionalities in that space. So I always have them write down like what emotions, as they kind of keep a graphic organizer of what are the five exhibits that were most impactful for you, like what racial content knowledge did you learn, and what emotions were you experiencing as you were at that. And so I mainly have white women students to not make that, but I do think that it would be very interesting. I don't know if EJI here is collecting any of that kind of data in terms of responses in the moment.
Yeah, because that would be something I would be curious, since I'm moving down, hopefully moving to Alabama,
Yeah.
to come up to one of your trips and see it, is to maybe kind of, if there's a way that we can passively do it too, because we don't want to I don't want to really disrupt anybody's as they go through there, especially going through that dog exhibit that you show. I mean, that should give some really powerful emotions. So, but yeah, I appreciate your answer on that. That was very thoughtful. So.
Yeah, the Birmingham Civil Rights Museum itself would be a good example of a counter museum, I think, in a lot of ways. Right across the street from the park in Birmingham.
And Amy may have some of that too, because her students were at the EJI counter monument.
I will say, I don't feel like my students engaged in the way that you're saying. Like, none of them felt like, why are we here? What's the point of this? But it was more of a like, everyone should come here. So many people don't know any of this story, and how can we communicate it? And they were very excited and passionate about, you know, there were pillars that are from Oklahoma, and like, what do we have to do? How do we get them? What's the project, you know? And so there was a lot of conversation after when I took my students to EJI, we met up with Sara and she talked to us about this idea of counter monuments, and they were like, we don't even have regular monuments, so like for any of these events. So like, what do we do? How do we get them here? So
That was probably before all of this year's attention to the
Mhm.
Oklahoma riots. Yeah.
Mm,
Yes, we went to the Greenwood Cultural Center, and they were like, we haven't received state funding. We've had no help, nothing since like 1985. And you could tell like this whole thing had been built in 1985. And then all of a sudden after that, it was like there's a lot of national attention. So I think there's been quite a few changes since then.
I wonder if there's a role for SSEC in this in terms of marshaling some resources and making available materials to folks who have the experiences you just described, but aren't prepared yet to take the next step in terms of, so what do we do with this now? I mean, SSEC has been known for years as a curriculum developer. And I could imagine a project that could produce primary source material and lesson plans that could be put up on the website and made a long-term resource for our members and anyone else who wants to follow up. So we ought to tuck that away in our memories to see what we might do.
I will say that so there's a very lengthy process and comprehensive process for a local county to create an organization to work with EJI to get a marker. And so those, I think it would be really neat to work with some of those county groups, because they are having to do research to know the history of the lynchings that happen in their county. They also have to do education about that within their community. Right. So I know Lee County here that I am in has a Lee County Remembrance Project. We just got not the pillar, but the historical marker in Opelika, right where I live, 2 weeks ago. And so the work of that group, there's 4 different committees that are involved. I'm involved with the education committee. But there's a lot of local people who are not historians who have been digging into archives and just kind of seeing that work. And so I think it would be really neat to partner up with these different counties that have gotten so far to get their first marker and really kind of
my county
together.
My county sorry, also has volunteers that have been doing that, and they've been placing the historic markers.
Thank you all very much, and we'll see you shortly in Prague.
Right, with our drinks.
With our drinks. Thank you. See you all. Thanks again.
Bye. Thank you.